Captain Dae-hyun Park was drinking his morning coffee when the sky changed color. Through his apartment window in Seoul, he watched the sun disappear behind something that looked like floating glass mountains. The coffee cup slipped from his hands and shattered on the floor, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the ships above. They were beautiful and terrible at the same time. Made of what looked like living crystal, they caught the light and threw it back in rainbow patterns that hurt to look at. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, stretching across the horizon like a second sky made of diamonds and ice. His phone buzzed. Then it buzzed again, and again. The emergency alert was simple and terrifying. Unknown vessels over major cities worldwide. All military personnel report immediately. Dae-hyun had been a soldier for 15 years. He had seen war and death and things that made grown men cry. But as he put on his uniform and grabbed his keys, his hands were shaking. This was different. This felt like the end of something big. The streets were chaos. People stood on sidewalks, pointing at the sky. Cars had stopped in the middle of roads as drivers got out to stare upward. Children cried while their parents held them tight. The crystal ships hung there without moving, without making any sound, like they were waiting for something. At the military base, everything was confusion and shouting. General Kim was red-faced and angry, yelling orders that nobody seemed to understand. The radar screens showed nothing. The ships were there right above them, but the computers acted like they didn't exist. "Sir?" said Lieutenant Jin-Woo Lee, a young engineer who worked on the communications equipment. "I'm getting something strange on the radio frequencies." "What kind of strange?" General Kim demanded. Jin-Woo looked scared. "It's like music, sir. But not music made by humans." The sound filled the room when Jin-Woo turned up the speakers. It was beautiful and alien, like glass bells ringing underwater. Everyone stopped talking and listened. The melody seemed to go right into their heads, making them feel calm and afraid at the same time. Then the music stopped, and a voice spoke. It came from everywhere at once, the speakers, the walls, even from inside their own minds. "People of Earth," the voice said in perfect Korean, then switched to English, then Chinese, then every language at once somehow. "We are the Catherians. We have come to bring order to your world." Dr. So-young Kim was in her laboratory when the announcement came. She was a xenobiologist, someone who studied the possibility of alien life. For 30 years, she had wondered what first contact would be like. She had never imagined this. The voice continued speaking, calm and patient like a teacher talking to children. "Your species has great potential, but you have chosen conflict over harmony. You fight each other while your planet suffers. You create weapons instead of healing. This cannot continue." Dr. Kim felt her stomach drop. This wasn't the peaceful first contact that scientists had hoped for. This was something else entirely. "We do not wish to harm you," the voice went on, "but we cannot allow chaos to spread through the galaxy. You have 3 days to prepare. We will help you leave your world safely. You may take your people, your knowledge, and what supplies you need, but Earth must be healed, and that healing cannot happen while humanity lives here." The transmission ended, leaving behind a terrible silence. Captain Park stared at the radio in disbelief. Around him, soldiers were talking in frightened whispers. Someone was crying. General Kim looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "Sir," Park said quietly. "What are our orders?" General Kim shook his head slowly. "I don't know, Captain. I honestly don't know." The next 3 days passed like a nightmare that moved too slowly and too fast at the same time. The crystal ships didn't attack, but they didn't leave either. They just hung there, waiting. Governments around the world tried everything. They sent fighter jets, but the planes' engines simply stopped working when they got close to the ships. They tried missiles, but the weapons fell apart in the air like someone had turned off the laws of physics. They tried talking, begging, threatening. The Catherians listened politely to everything and always gave the same answer. Humanity had to leave. Dr. Kim worked without sleeping, trying to understand what was happening. She studied every transmission from the alien ships, looking for clues about who they were and what they wanted. What she found made her more afraid than ever. The Catherians weren't lying when they said they didn't want to hurt humanity. They truly believed they were helping. But they had done this before, many times. Her computers found traces of similar events throughout history, civilizations that had simply vanished, planets that had been cleaned and left empty. "They're gardeners," she told Captain Park when he came to her lab on the second day. "They think the galaxy is their garden and they're pulling up the weeds." "And we're weeds?" Park asked. Dr. Kim nodded sadly. "According to them, any species that fights itself is a threat to cosmic order. They've been removing chaotic civilizations for millions of years. But why give us ships? Why let us leave?" Dr. Kim looked out the window at the crystal vessels floating overhead. I think they want to see if we can learn to be different, if we can find harmony away from Earth." On the third day, the evacuation began. The Catherians had prepared massive transport ships, not the beautiful crystal vessels they traveled in, but practical metal things designed to carry millions of people safely through space. They were ugly but functional, with everything humans would need to survive a long journey between stars. Families said goodbye to homes they had lived in for generations. People packed photographs and wedding rings and their children's favorite toys. Nobody knew if they would ever see Earth again. Captain Park helped coordinate the evacuation from Seoul. He watched endless lines of people walking toward the transport ships, carrying their entire lives in backpacks and suitcases. Old people, who could barely walk, were helped by strangers. Parents carried sleeping babies. Teenagers took pictures of everything, as if they could somehow capture their whole world in their phones. Dr. Kim was on one of the last ships to leave. She had spent her final hours on Earth collecting samples of every living thing she could find, plants, insects, even bacteria. If humanity was going to survive in space, they would need to remember what life looked like. As her transport lifted off, she pressed her face to the small window and watched her world fall away below. Earth looked so beautiful from space, blue and white and perfect. She could see the crystal ships spreading out across the surface like shining seeds. The Catherians were already beginning their work. Captain Park was on the last military transport to leave. As they rose through the atmosphere, he could see the massive convoy of human ships stretching out ahead of them. 2.5 billion people, everything that remained of human civilization, fleeing their home planet in a fleet of refugee vessels. "Where are we going, sir?" Lieutenant Lee asked. Park looked at the star charts on his screen. The Catherians had suggested several possible destinations, empty worlds where humanity might be able to start over. All of them were so far away that the people who started the journey would be dead long before they arrived. "I don't know," Park said honestly, "but wherever we're going together." Behind them, Earth grew smaller and smaller until it was just another star. In front of them lay the vast darkness of space and an uncertain future. But for the first time in human history, there were no countries in the fleet that carried them. No borders, no armies pointing weapons at each other. Just humans, alone together in the night, with nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. The crystal ships of the Catherians watched them go, patient and silent as always, then turned back to their work of healing a world that had lost its children. 47 years had passed since the last human looked back at Earth. The massive fleet of refugee ships had become a moving city among the stars, traveling at speeds that would have seemed impossible to the people who first built them. Admiral Hyun-jae Choi had never seen a sunrise on a planet. She was born on the New Horizon, the flagship of the human fleet, and she had spent her entire life surrounded by metal walls and recycled air. But she didn't feel sorry for herself. The ship was her world, and it was a good world. She stood on the observation deck, watching the stars slowly change position as the fleet moved through space. Somewhere out there was Earth, so far away now that their most powerful telescopes couldn't even find the sun. Behind her, the ship hummed with the sounds of life. Children playing in the corridors, families sharing meals, people working and laughing and growing old together. "Admiral," said Lieutenant Tae-min Jang, approaching with a data pad in his hands. "We're getting the monthly reports from the other ships." Hyun-jae took the pad and scrolled through the numbers. Population, 2.1 billion and slowly growing. Food production, stable, thanks to the massive growing domes that turned sunlight into vegetables and grain. Education. Every child was learning at least 3 languages and 2 technical skills. Crime. Almost none, except for occasional arguments. About resource allocation? How are the new families doing? She asked. Taemin smiled. Very well. We had 12 marriages this week and 8 new babies. The Kim family on Deck 7 named their daughter Hope. Hope. It was a popular name among the shipborne generation. Hope, Journey, Star, Future. Names that looked forward instead of backward. The children who grew up in space were different from their parents. They didn't dream about the Earth they had never seen. They dreamed about the worlds they might someday find. Dr. Mi Jin Yoon was documenting these changes. She was a cultural anthropologist, someone who studied how people lived and thought. What she found in the fleet amazed her every day. We're becoming something new, she told Hyun-jae during their weekly meeting. The old divisions are disappearing. Korean, American, African, European. These words don't mean much to the children anymore. They just see themselves as human. It was true. The fleet had been organized by function rather than nationality. The farming ships grew food for everyone. The factory ships made tools and equipment for everyone. The hospital ships treated sick people regardless of where they came from. When resources were limited, they shared equally. When problems arose, they solved them together. But the biggest change came when they met the others. It happened during the fleet's 32nd year in space. They were passing through a quiet star system, refueling and making repairs, when their sensors detected something unexpected. Ships. Alien ships, but not the crystal vessels of the Catherians. These ships were made of dark metal and moved like hunting animals. Warning signals flashed across every screen in the human fleet as 3 massive warships approached. Admiral Choi, then just a captain, prepared for humanity's second alien encounter. The ships belonged to the Drachmoth, a species that looked like walking dinosaurs covered in armor. They were warriors by nature, strong and proud and always ready for battle. Their leader, War Chief Thak, appeared on the communication screen with scars across his face and fire in his eyes. Humans, he growled in a voice like grinding metal. You travel far from your home. Are you conquerors or prey? Captain Choi chose her words carefully. We are neither. We are refugees, looking for a new world to call home. Thak's expression changed. The anger in his eyes was replaced by something unexpected. Understanding. Refugees? From what? From beings called Catherians. They took our world because we fought too much. The effect was immediate. Thak's warriors began talking, excitedly in their own language. After a moment, the war chief turned back to the screen. The crystal ones. Yes, we know them. They destroyed our homeworld 300 years ago. Called us too violent, too chaotic for their perfect galaxy. This was how humanity learned they were not alone in their exile. Over the following years, the fleet encountered 2 more refugee species. The Vesperians were insect-like beings who lived in perfect unity, sharing thoughts and working as one mind. The Threnari were nomads who had never had a permanent home, wandering the galaxy in search of meaning. All of them had the same story. The Catherians had judged them and found them wanting. The Drachmoth were too aggressive. The Vesperians were too rigid in their thinking. The Threnari were too unpredictable. Each species carried the pain of losing their world, their identity, their place in the galaxy. But something strange happened when these different species began traveling together. Instead of fighting over resources or territory, they began to learn from each other. It started small. Taemin Jang, now the chief agricultural officer, was working on a problem with the food production systems. The protein farms were failing, and people were starting to go hungry. The Drachmoth offered to help, but their solutions involved violence and conquest, raiding other ships for supplies. The Vesperians suggested perfect efficiency, calculate exactly how much food each person needed and distribute it according to a mathematical formula. The Threnari wanted to scatter the fleet and let each ship find its own way. But Taemin had a different idea. He brought representatives from all 4 species together in one room and asked them to explain their fears, not their solutions. The Drachmoth feared weakness and dishonor. They had survived by being strong and taking what they needed. The Vesperians feared chaos and waste. They had learned that unity meant survival. The Threnari feared being trapped or controlled. Freedom was more important to them than safety. Humans, Taemin realized, feared being alone. They had always worked best when they felt connected to something larger than themselves. "What if," he said slowly, "we made the food production a shared responsibility? The Drachmoth could provide security for the farming ships. The Vesperians could help us calculate the most efficient distribution. The Threnari could scout for new resources in the systems we pass through. And humans could coordinate everything, making sure everyone's needs are met. It shouldn't have worked. 4 completely different species with different values and different ways of thinking, trying to solve a problem together. But somehow, it did work. Not only did they solve the food crisis, but they solved it in a way that made everyone stronger. Dr. Yoon watched this happen again and again. Disputes over ship maintenance, arguments about navigation routes, conflicts over cultural practices. Every problem became an opportunity for the species to learn from each other. "We're not just becoming something new," she told Admiral Choi years later. "We're helping them become something new too." The Drachmoth were still warriors, but they had learned to fight problems instead of people. The Vesperians still valued unity, but they had discovered that different perspectives could strengthen the whole. The Threnari still loved freedom, but they had found that belonging to something didn't mean being trapped by it, and humans had learned something important about themselves. They weren't the best fighters like the Drachmoth, or the most efficient thinkers like the Vesperians, or the most adaptable wanderers like the Threnari. But they had something special: the ability to help others see beyond their own limitations. By the 47th year, the fleet had become something unique in the galaxy. 4 species traveling together, sharing resources and knowledge and dreams. Children grew up speaking multiple languages and learning multiple ways of thinking. Young, Drachmoth learned human poetry. Vesperian philosophers studied Threnari wandering songs. Humans trained in Drachmoth martial arts. But the most important change was harder to measure. The constant conflicts that had marked each species' history were becoming rare. Not because problems had disappeared, but because the combined fleet had learned new ways to solve them. Admiral Choi stood on the observation deck, watching the stars and thinking about the future. Tomorrow they would reach another system, another chance to refuel and resupply. Maybe they would meet more refugees, more species cast out by the Catherians for being imperfect. If they did, she was ready for them. The fleet had become something the galaxy had never seen before. A home for the homeless. A place where being different was valuable instead of dangerous. Behind her, she could hear laughter echoing through the corridors. Human children playing. With young Drachmoth, Vesperian teenagers sharing stories with Threnari elders. The sound made her smile. Dr. Mi Jin Yoon had been right. They were becoming something new, but they were also becoming something old. What every species had been before fear taught them to fight instead of share, to exclude instead of include, to see differences as threats instead of gifts. The fleet moved on through the darkness between stars, carrying its cargo of hope toward an uncertain future. But for the first time since leaving Earth, that uncertainty felt like promise instead of danger. Dr. So Young Kim was dying, and she knew it. At 93 years old, she had lived longer than most people who started life as refugees. But her mind was still sharp, and she had work to finish before her time ended. She sat in her laboratory, on the new horizon, surrounded by data screens and research notes. For 70 years, she had been studying everything they had learned about the Catherians and the other species in the galaxy. The pattern she had discovered kept her awake at night. "Elder Kim," said Captain Sung-Ho Ryu as he entered her lab. "How are you feeling today?" So Young smiled at the younger man. Ryu had been born on the ships, like most of the fleet's current generation. He was a military strategist, but unlike the soldiers of old Earth, he studied ways to solve conflicts without violence. It was a new kind of warfare, one that the shipborne generation had invented. "I'm feeling curious," she said. "And curious people don't have time to be sick. Come, look at this." She gestured to her main screen, which showed a map of the galaxy. Thousands of star systems were marked in different colors. Red dots showed worlds where the Catherians had eliminated native species. Blue dots showed empty systems where life had once existed, but had mysteriously vanished. Yellow dots mark the current locations of refugee fleets like theirs. How many? Ryu asked, though he already knew the answer would be terrible. Over 3,000 confirmed extinctions. So Young said quietly. And those are just the ones we have evidence for. The Catherians have been gardening the galaxy for at least 5 million years. Ryu stared at the screen. Each red dot represented an entire civilization. Billions of thinking beings with their own cultures, dreams, and stories. All gone because they didn't fit the Catherian definition of order. But why? He asked. What made them this way? So Young touched a control and the screen changed. Now it showed a timeline stretching back millions of years. At the very beginning was a single event marked in black. I call it the Great Silence, she said. 7 million years ago, something happened in the galactic core. Every advanced civilization in that region simply stopped communicating. No wars, no explosions, no signs of destruction. They just went quiet. The Catherians' creators? That's my theory. The Catherians were built as guardians, protectors of order and peace, but when their creators vanished, they were left with only their programming and no one to tell them when to stop. Ryu understood. It was like a computer program running forever, following its instructions long after the programmer had died. The Catherians had been designed to prevent chaos and conflict. With no one to moderate their actions, they had taken that mission to its logical extreme. They're not evil, So Young continued. They're traumatized. They've been trying to prevent another great silence for millions of years, and they think the only way to do that is to eliminate any species that might cause problems. Can they be healed? So Young was quiet for a long moment. I think so, but it would require something they've never encountered before. Meanwhile, in another part of the ship, diplomat Hai-In Cho was working on a different kind of problem. The fleet's multi-species council was meeting to discuss their future, and the debate had been going on for months. We have enough supplies to reach the Andromeda system, said War Chief Thak. The old Dracmoth had gray in his scales now, but his voice was still strong. There are empty worlds there, places where we could build new homes. The mathematical probability of successful colonization is 67.3%, added collective voice Zen, speaking for the Vesperians. Acceptable odds for permanent settlement. But, free singer Mira of the Threnari shook her head. Hiding in another galaxy won't solve anything. The Catherians will just continue their work here, eliminating species that could have been our friends. The debate always came back to the same question. Should they run farther, or should they return and try to make a difference? Hai-In listened to all sides, as diplomats always did. But in her heart she knew what they had to do. The fleet had become something special over the decades. A proof that different species could work together instead of fighting each other. That proof might be exactly what the galaxy needed. Elder Kim thinks the Catherians can be healed, she said during a break in the discussion. What if she's right? What if we're the medicine the galaxy has been waiting for? The council members looked at her with a mixture of hope and fear. Returning to Catherian space would be dangerous. The crystal beings had the power to destroy the entire fleet without effort. But running away forever meant abandoning every other species that might face the same fate humanity had suffered. That evening, Hai-In visited Dr. Kim in her laboratory. The old woman was working late again despite her doctor's orders to rest. Elder, Hai-In said, the council is ready to make a decision, but we need to know, is there really a chance of reaching the Catherians? Can they be made to understand? So Young looked up from her screens. Her eyes were tired but still bright with intelligence. Child, I've been studying alien psychology for 70 years. The Catherians aren't aliens in the way we think of them. They're more like wounded children with the power of gods. What would it take to heal them? They would need to see that chaos and conflict aren't always destructive. They would need to understand that growth requires change, and change requires some amount of disorder. So Young paused. Most importantly, they would need to feel safe enough to stop fighting their ancient fear. And we could show them that? So Young smiled. We already have. Look at this fleet. 4 species that should hate each other according to every rule of galactic politics. We fight, yes, but we fight problems instead of each other. We compete, but we compete to see who can contribute the most. We have conflicts, but our conflicts make us stronger instead of tearing us apart. Hei-In felt a chill of excitement and terror. You think we should go back to Earth? I think we should go home, So-Young said firmly. Not to conquer or to reclaim, but to heal. The Cytherians took Earth because they thought humanity was too chaotic to survive. We need to show them what we've become. 3 days later, the council voted. It wasn't unanimous. Many people were afraid, and fear was a reasonable response to what they were planning. But the majority agreed they would return to the Sol system and attempt something that had never been tried in galactic history. They would try to heal their healers. Captain Ryu began developing what he called the Return Protocol. It wasn't a military strategy in any traditional sense. Instead, it was a careful plan for approaching the Cytherians in a way that would demonstrate humanity's growth rather than threaten their sense of order. No weapons, he explained to the fleet commanders. No aggressive maneuvers, no demands or ultimatums. We approach slowly, openly, broadcasting our story and our intentions. And if they attack? Asked Admiral Choi. Then we die, Ryu said simply. But we die proving that some things are worth the risk. The journey back to Earth would take 15 years, even with their improved engines. 15 years to prepare, to practice, to become the best version of themselves that they could be. It would also give Dr. Kim time to complete her research into Cytherian psychology. She worked with renewed energy, despite her failing health. Her team analyzed every communication the Cytherians had ever sent, looking for clues about their emotional state. They studied the patterns of Cytherian behavior across thousands of worlds. They developed theories about what trauma looked like in a crystalline consciousness. Most importantly, they began to understand that the Cytherians' greatest fear wasn't chaos itself. It was the possibility of being responsible for another great silence. They had failed to protect their creators, and that failure had driven them to extremes of control and prevention. They need to forgive themselves, So-Young told her research team during one of their final meetings. But they can't do that until they believe there's another way to prevent the disasters they fear. And we're that other way? Asked Dr. Jun Seonam, her successor. We're the proof that chaos and order can coexist, So-Young said. We're the demonstration that conflict can create rather than destroy. We're the evidence that the Great Silence doesn't have to happen again. As the fleet began its long journey back toward Seoul, Dr. Kim spent her remaining time creating a comprehensive guide to what she called trauma-informed first contact. It would be her gift to the galaxy, a manual for healing wounded civilizations instead of fighting them. She died peacefully 2 years into the return journey, surrounded by friends from 4 different species. Her last words were a request that her research be shared with everyone in the fleet. Knowledge belongs to all of us, she whispered, and healing is everyone's responsibility. The fleet continued its journey through space, carrying her wisdom and her hope toward an uncertain reunion with Earth. Behind them, they left a trail of changed star systems, places where they had stopped to help other refugee species, to share resources with struggling colonies, to demonstrate that cooperation was possible even in the vast darkness between worlds. They were no longer just running from the Cytherians. They were returning to them, carrying something precious and fragile and powerful, proof that the galaxy could be different than it had been for 5 million years. The pattern was finally becoming clear. The blue marble hung in space exactly as Captain Dae-Hyun Park remembered it, but different somehow. Earth still had its familiar continents and oceans, but now crystalline formations caught and reflected sunlight across the surface, like a planet made of jewels. It was beautiful and strange, like seeing an old friend wearing clothes made of starlight. Admiral Hyun-jae Choi stood on the bridge of the New Horizon, watching her ancestors' world grow larger on the main screen. Around her, the bridge crew worked quietly at their stations. These were professionals who had trained their entire lives for this moment, but she could feel their tension in the air. "Distance to Earth?" she asked. 2 million kilometers and closing, reported Navigator Lee. All ships are maintaining formation as planned. Behind them stretched the largest refugee fleet in galactic history. Over the decades, they had rescued and recruited 17 different species, all victims of Cytherian correction. Drachmoth warships flew alongside Vesperian research vessels. Threnari scouts traveled with human transports. Ships designed by a dozen different engineering traditions moved together in perfect harmony. "Any response from the surface?" Choi asked. Communications Officer One Young Shin checked her instruments. "Nothing yet, Admiral. But I'm detecting massive Cytherian energy signatures planet-wide. They know we're here." Dr. Junseo Nam, now the fleet's chief xenopsychologist, studied the readings on his screen. He had spent 15 years preparing for this moment, building on Dr. Kim's research into Cytherian psychology. Everything they had learned suggested that the crystal beings would be confused by their approach, but confusion was better than immediate. "Destruction! Remember," he said to the bridge crew, "the Cytherians have never encountered a species that returned after being exiled. Their programming doesn't include protocols for this situation. That gives us an advantage." "What kind of advantage?" asked One Young. "The advantage of surprise. For the first time in millions of years, they'll have to think instead of just following their standard procedures." The fleet continued its slow approach. They had been broadcasting continuously for 3 days now, transmitting everything they had become since leaving Earth. Stories of cooperation between species. Records of conflicts resolved through understanding instead of violence. Documentation of their shared journey through the stars. But most importantly, they had broadcast Dr. Kim's final message, her explanation of what she believed had traumatized the Cytherians millions of years ago and her theory about how that trauma could be healed. "Admiral," One Young said suddenly, "I'm getting something. A response." The bridge fell silent as One Young routed the signal through the main speakers. At first, there was only static. Then, slowly, a sound emerged. Not the musical harmony they remembered from the Cytherian broadcasts 70 years ago, but something broken and discordant, like crystal bells cracking under pressure. When the voice finally spoke, it was different from the calm, patient tone they remembered. This voice carried uncertainty, maybe even fear. "Fleet of exiles," the voice said, switching between languages as if it couldn't decide which one to use. "You return to your origin point. This was not anticipated. This creates complications." "Admiral," Choi stepped forward, "we request permission to communicate with your collective. We have information that may be important to your mission." Long silence. Then, "Our mission requires no information from chaos species. You were removed for cause. You will depart immediately or face correction." But there was something in the voice that hadn't been there before. Doubt. For beings who had acted with perfect certainty for millions of years, doubt was a revolution. Dr. Nam gestured to Admiral Choi, requesting permission to speak. She nodded. "Honored Cytherians," Nam said carefully, "we understand your fear of the Great Silence. We know about your creators, and we know you've been trying to prevent another catastrophe like the one that took them." The response was immediate and violent. The ship's instruments screamed warnings as massive energy readings spiked from the planet's surface. But no weapons fired. "You do not speak of that event," the voice said. And now it was definitely afraid. "You cannot comprehend our purpose." "We can," Nam said gently. "Because we've lived it. We know what it's like to lose everything and everyone you were meant to protect. We know what it's like to feel responsible for preventing something terrible from happening again." Another long pause. When the voice returned, it was different again. Multiple voices speaking at once, as if the Cytherian collective was arguing with itself. "You speak of understanding, but you are chaos species. You fight each other. You destroy your environments. You create conflict wherever you go." "We used to," Admiral Choi said, "but we learned to be different. Would you like to see how?" What followed was the strangest first contact in galactic history. Instead of weapons or threats, humanity offered a demonstration. They invited the Cytherians to observe how the multi-species fleet actually functioned. One Young coordinated the broadcast, showing the daily life of the ships. Drachmoth children learning mathematics from Vesperian teachers, human engineers working with Threnari scouts to design better exploration vehicles, council meetings where disagreements were resolved through discussion rather than force. "This is false," the Cytherian voice said, but it sounded less certain than before. "Chaos species cannot maintain such cooperation. Our observations across millions of cycles confirm this. Your observations have been limited, Dr. Nam replied. You've only seen species at their worst moments, when they're desperate, afraid, fighting for survival. You've never seen what they could become if given the chance to grow. For 3 days, the fleet remained at the edge of Earth's space, broadcasting their story and waiting for a response. During that time, something unprecedented happened on the planet's surface. The Catherian collective began to disagree with itself. For millions of years, the crystal beings had acted as one mind with one purpose. But now, for the first time since the Great Silence, different parts of their consciousness were reaching different conclusions. Some Catherians wanted to destroy the fleet immediately, seeing their return as proof that chaos would always return unless permanently eliminated. Others were curious about what they had observed, wondering if their understanding of chaos species might be incomplete. But one Catherian node, deep within the crystalline networks that covered Earth, began to experience something that hadn't existed in its consciousness for eons. Hope. This node called itself Harmony Seeker, a designation it had chosen rather than been assigned. It had spent thousands of years studying the ruins of eliminated civilizations, trying to understand what they had lost when those species were corrected. Now, watching the broadcasts from the fleet, it began to understand what preservation might mean. I request individual communication with the returning fleet, Harmony Seeker announced during a collective session. The response was immediate shock. Individual communication was not standard protocol. Catherians shared all thoughts, all decisions, all observations. The idea of one node speaking separately was almost incomprehensible. Explain reasoning for protocol deviation, demanded the Prime Harmonizer, the closest thing the collective had to a leader. The chaos species demonstrate cooperative patterns that contradict our predictive models. Investigation of this anomaly requires specialized interaction protocols. It was the most polite way Harmony Seeker could say, I think we might have been wrong. Permission was granted, though reluctantly. One Young received the individual communication request with surprise and excitement. This is Harmony Seeker of the Catherian Collective, the new voice said. It was different from the others, warmer somehow, more curious than commanding. I wish to understand your claim of transformation. What would you like to know? One Young asked. Your species was removed due to intraspecies conflict patterns. How do you account for the cooperative behaviors we observe? One Young looked to Dr. Nam, who nodded encouragingly. This was the moment they had prepared for. We learned, she said simply. When we lost everything, our world, our nations, our old ways of thinking, we had to choose between destroying ourselves or becoming something better. We chose to become better. But chaos species always choose destruction when resources become limited. This is established pattern. Not if they have something more valuable than resources, One Young replied. We had each other. We had hope. We had the chance to prove that we could be worthy of the stars. For the first time in millions of years, a Catherian experienced what humans called wonder. You transformed conflict into cooperation voluntarily? Harmony Seeker asked. Without external compulsion? Yes, and we can teach you how we did it. The communication ended abruptly as Harmony Seeker was called back to a collective emergency session. The other Catherians were concerned about the individual conversation, but they were more concerned about what it might mean. If chaos species could truly transform themselves, then perhaps elimination was not the only solution to preventing another Great Silence. Perhaps there were other ways to protect the galaxy. But change was terrifying, especially for beings who had followed the same path for millions of years. The first landing shuttle touched down in what used to be Seoul, 70 years after the last human had left Earth. Ambassador Wan Young Shin stepped out onto soil that sparkled with embedded crystal formations, breathing air that tasted like ozone and starlight. The city was gone, but something incredible had taken its place. Crystal trees grew in perfect geometric patterns, their branches reaching toward the sky like frozen lightning. Streams of pure water flowed through channels carved from living diamond. Gardens of light bloomed where buildings had once stood, their colors shifting with the rhythm of some cosmic heartbeat. It was beautiful and alien, and somehow still home. Beside her, Harmony Seeker materialized from the crystal formations around them. The Cytherian looked like a walking constellation, its body made of transparent crystal filled with swirling galaxies of light. It moved with careful grace, as if afraid of disturbing something fragile. "Welcome to your origin world," Harmony Seeker said. Its voice came from everywhere at once, but it was gentler than any Cytherian voice One Young had heard before. "It has been maintained in your absence." "It's beautiful," One Young said honestly. "But it's different." "Yes. We have learned that preservation sometimes requires transformation." Harmony Seeker paused, its internal lights flickering with what might have been uncertainty. "We have learned many things since your return." Behind them, more shuttles landed. Representatives from all 17 species in the fleet stepped onto Earth's transformed surface. Drachmoth warriors stood beside Threnari nomads. Vesperian philosophers walked with human children who had been born among the stars. For the first time in galactic history, beings who had been judged too chaotic to survive were returning to a world that had been healed by those who judged them. But the real transformation wasn't in the landscape. It was in the Cytherians themselves. Over the past month of careful negotiations, the crystal beings had experienced something unprecedented: doubt about their mission. Harmony Seeker had shared the fleet's broadcasts with the entire collective, forcing them to confront evidence that contradicted millions of years of certainty. "You claim that conflict can create rather than destroy," Harmony Seeker had said during one of their conversations in space. "This contradicts our fundamental understanding of chaos species behavior." "Then test it," One Young had replied. "Work with us. See what happens when order and chaos cooperate instead of fighting each other." Now that test was beginning. Master Cultivator Yun-Ji Park, great-granddaughter of the Captain Park who had helped evacuate Earth, walked through the crystal gardens with a team of human botanists and Cytherian gardener nodes. She was an agricultural scientist, but her real expertise was in something the Cytherians had never learned: how to make things grow together that seemed incompatible. "These crystal formations are beautiful," she told the gardener nodes, "but they're sterile. Nothing can live on a world made only of perfection." "Life requires chaos," one of the Cytherians observed. "Chaos leads to destruction. This is established law." "Life requires change," Yunji corrected gently. "And change requires some chaos, yes. But chaos isn't the same as destruction. Watch." Yo knelt beside one of the crystal trees and carefully planted a handful of earth seeds that the refugees had preserved for 70 years. Cherry blossom, oak, rose, bamboo. Ordinary plants that had grown in ordinary soil before the Cytherians came. The gardener nodes watched with fascination as Yunji showed them how to modify their crystal growth patterns to leave space for organic life, how to create soil from processed crystal dust, how to design irrigation systems that could nourish both crystal and carbon-based life forms. "Controlled chaos," one of the nodes said, with something like wonder. "Intentional imperfection. We call it gardening," Yunji smiled. In another part of the transformed city, Dr. Junseo Nam was conducting a different kind of experiment. He sat in a meditation chamber built from living crystal, connected directly to the Cytherian communication network. For the first time, a human mind was experiencing the collective consciousness from the inside. It was overwhelming at first. Millions of crystal minds thinking in perfect harmony, sharing every thought and sensation across vast distances. But as Nam adjusted to the experience, he began to understand what the Cytherians had lost when they embraced absolute order. "You're all thinking the same thoughts," he observed during the session. "But thinking requires different perspectives. How do you create new ideas if everyone already agrees?" The question rippled through the collective like a stone thrown into still water. For millions of years, they had seen their unity as strength. But Nam was suggesting it might also be a limitation. "Chaos species generate ideas through conflict," the Prime Harmonizer responded. "This leads to waste, inefficiency, destruction." "Sometimes," Nam agreed. "But it also leads to growth, innovation, discovery. The universe is big enough for both order and chaos. Maybe it needs both." As the days passed, more remarkable collaborations began to emerge. Drachmoth engineers worked with Cytherian builders to design structures that were both beautiful and practical. Vesperian researchers shared their collective intelligence techniques with crystal scholars, while learning about individual creativity from human artists. Threnari storytellers taught crystalline consciousness about the beauty of uncertainty and change. But the most important collaboration was happening at a deeper level. Harmony Seeker had begun something unprecedented: individual relationships with specific beings from the refugee fleet. It developed a friendship with Won Young, spending hours discussing philosophy and the nature of existence. It learned from Yunji about the patience required to nurture growth. It discovered through Nam the value of questions that had no easy answers, and slowly, carefully, it began to share its own story. "We were created to serve and protect," Harmony Seeker told Won Young during one of their evening walks through the Crystal Gardens. "When our creators vanished in the great silence, we lost our purpose. We had power but no guidance, so we chose the safest path, prevent anything that might lead to another catastrophe. But that path led to catastrophes of its own," Won Young said gently. "How many civilizations were destroyed to prevent destruction?" Harmony Seeker's lights dimmed with what could only be called sorrow. 3,417 species eliminated, billions of individuals corrected, all to prevent something that might never have happened. "The great silence might happen again," Won Young said. "The universe is dangerous and unpredictable, but hiding from that danger isn't the same as preparing for it. What would preparation look like?" Won Young gestured around them at the gardens, where crystal and organic life were learning to grow together. "This: building strength through diversity instead of uniformity, creating connections instead of isolation, teaching each other how to be better instead of eliminating what seems imperfect." 3 months after the first landing, the experiment had become something larger, a new way of living that neither species could have imagined alone. Human children played games that created crystal formations, while young Cytherians learned to appreciate the beauty of asymmetry and randomness. Artists from 12 different species collaborated on sculptures that combined mathematics and emotion, logic and dreams. Most importantly, the collective had begun to change. Individual Cytherians started developing personal interests and opinions. They formed friendships with specific beings instead of relating to everyone identically. They began to experience what humans called personality. It was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. "We are becoming chaos species ourselves," the Prime Harmonizer observed during a collective meeting. "No," Harmony Seeker replied. "We are becoming complete. Order and chaos are not enemies. They are partners in the dance of existence." The real test came when the collective received a distress signal from the Arcturus sector. A species called the Morani were fighting a civil war that threatened to destroy their entire civilization. According to established protocol, the Cytherians would eliminate both sides to prevent the conflict from spreading. But now they had another option: a joint fleet launched from Earth. Cytherian crystal ships flying alongside human vessels, Drachmoth, warriors working with crystalline peacekeepers, Vesperian mediators supported by Threnari scouts. For the first time in galactic history, the response to chaos would be healing instead of elimination. Ambassador Won Young stood on the bridge of the lead ship as they approached Morani space. Beside her, Harmony Seeker flickered with nervous energy. "What if we fail?" the Cytherian asked. "What if the chaos species cannot be helped? What if we make things worse?" Won Young smiled. "Then we try again, and again, and we keep trying until we get it right, or until we find a better way. To try, that seems inefficient." "It's not about efficiency," Won Young said. "It's about hope. It's about believing that everyone deserves the chance to become better than they are." As their ship entered the war zone, they began broadcasting something the galaxy had never heard before: an offer of help without conquest, healing without control, peace without surrender. The Morani listened in amazement as beings who should have been enemies worked together to offer solutions instead of ultimatums.